So without any further ado, we're going to move on to Craig Mcadam from Bug Life, who's going to start sharing his screen. Craig's been an invertebrate ecologist for over 25 years. I met him in a previous role when he was helping me with riverfly identification and setting up riverfly workshops. Hugely experienced, and he's the conservation director for Bug Life. Craig, take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Nick, and it's great to see so many people here to hear these talks tonight. As Nick said, I'm going to do the doom and gloom bit and talk about insect declines, and then my colleague Claire is going to talk about what we can do to help them. So I'm going to talk about insect declines, but first of all, I'm going to just introduce you to Bug Life. So Bug Life is the only organisation in Europe concerned with the conservation of all invertebrates. Our aim is to halt invertebrate extinctions and achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates in the UK. By invertebrates, we mean everything from moths to mayflies, millipedes. We talk about starfish, stoneflies, the whole range of invertebrates. We do this through a number of different methods. We go out there, we inspire people, we go out and show them bugs and show them the habitats that they live on, get them up close to different invertebrates. We try and shape policy, so we try and influence decision makers to make sure that they're making the right choices for invertebrates and their habitats. And just some examples there of our freshwater strategy and our pollinator strategy, which in the things that we want to see society do for invertebrates. We undertake practical conservation work, whether that's creating wildflower meadows or this bog restoration work that we've been doing in central Scotland in Falkirk. And we go out there and we do awareness raising. We do things like this, talks like this, or walks or workshops. So a whole range of stuff that we do. And the reason we do this is because we think that invertebrates are important. But we do get asked, are they important? What is the importance of invertebrates? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we cover the whole range of invertebrates. There's somewhere in the region of about 40,000 species in the UK. We're not sure of the full number because some of them are tiny mites and nematode worms that some people don't even know they're there. But we try and cover them all. We look at their needs, and when we look at them in context to other wildlife groups in Britain, we look at fungi, which come in at about 15,000 species, plants at just under 3,000 species, lichens just under 2,000 species. And then a bunch of other things, mammals, bats, amphibians, fish, birds, all those really characteristic and those things that we think of when we think of wildlife. But they actually only that little tip of the pyramid of life that we're interested in. And invertebrates are the bulk of our biodiversity. And they provide a huge range of different services and ecological roles. Just some examples here. They provide pollination services, so pollinating our crops and our wildflowers. They recycle nutrients and decompose waste. They provide food for other animals like fish and birds. They in fresh waters they'll perform some water purification processes. And in the soil, they help increase the health of the soil and degrade organic matter. But what we're talking about here, the title of this session is "How Clean's Your Screen," and I picked this off of the internet. This image, which for those of you that remember back maybe 43 years ago, this is kind of a regular occurrence that you would have when you were traveling anywhere for a long distance. You would have to stop a couple of times to clean your windscreen on your car, and because the number of insects that had hit it and splatted on it would obscure the vision. And this is perhaps an extreme example. I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody drive with this amount on it. I can't remember from my childhood this amount, but I do remember having to stop driving through parts of Scotland and have to clean my dad cleaning his car windscreen. And whilst this might seem a bit like a old wives' tale, it's actually borne out in some of the evidence that we've got from science. This study here was undertaken in Denmark, and it looked at the number of insects on car windscreens counted on transects between 1997 and 2017. And it showed that there'd been an 80% decline in the number of insects hitting windscreen of a car over a short distance. And when you took that up to a longer distance, it was a 97% decline over that period. And this is important because one of the things that, when we talk about that window screen effect and that phenomenon, is that people say, but cars have changed. They're no longer as unaerodynamic as they were back in the 1970s. You know, those block style, angular sort of like car designs that we used to have. Now they're a lot more streamlined and a lot more aerodynamic. So the insects aren't hitting them as much, perhaps because they're getting deflected off by the air currents. But this study is in modern times, if you like, and it is in the times when we've had sleeker, more aerodynamic cars. So this actually shows that there is something in those claims of that decline in number of insect windscreens. Bringing it up a bit closer to modern day, in 2019, early 2019, there was a paper published in Biological Conservation, which talked about the worldwide decline of the entomofauna, so worldwide decline of insects. And it was a review of a whole bunch of papers that had looked at declines in insects, and it brought together all that information to show just how bad the problem was. And this is just a graphic from that paper, which shows that that for different groups, the types of declines, the amount of species that were in decline, and the species that were threatened with extinction. And you can see here the first sort of block of a chart is the insects, and you can see the total figure in the first row: 41% of species are threatened with extinction, which is, mind-boggling to think. And as you break it down into the different groups, you see that caddisflies particularly bad, with over 60% in decline and threatened with extinction. Similar numbers of, what, about 50% for moths and butterflies, ladybirds, grasshoppers, and so on. When you compare that to vertebrates, to that little bit at the top of that pyramid, and you see that insects are actually at twice the risk or rate of decline than some of the vertebrates. So, and you see there 22% of species are in rapid decline for vertebrates. There is something particular going on within insects, and we can dig into that information and look at some of those papers to understand a little bit more about that. This is quite an interesting study. This was a study that was done in Germany, and it looked at insect abundance, not just where the species were, but how abundant they were. And that's really key, because if we just look at where a species is, it can still be there, but it could be half the number that we've seen before in previous years. And this study looked at insect biomass, the number of insects across 27-year period, and it found that it had fallen by around about 3/4 over that period. But what was really key about this study was that this wasn't just in the countryside, this was in protected areas. This was in the areas that should be protecting these species from harm. So if it's happening, if you're getting a 75% decline in protected areas, what on earth is going on in the rest of the countryside where it's a bit of a free-for-all for these species? So that's Germany, and that, is it just a particular European problem or a particular country's problem? Well, actually, no, this is happening at a global scale. This is a graphic from a paper which looked at the global, produced a global index of invertebrate abundance. And it found the same sort of thing, that there were massive declines in many groups of invertebrate. And just 2 lines on this graph here, which shows that, moths and butterflies seems to be quite a steady decline over the time period, over the 40 years in this graph. But other invertebrates, there's some steep declines in there, and they kind of reach a sort of rock bottom sort of level. Keep an eye on that graph then, just that slope of that graph, and that's at the global scale, so that's looking worldwide. If we bring it back to the UK, back to Britain, and have a look at butterflies, which that orange line represents, we can see that it actually covers the same, it has the same sort of profile, the same trend in Britain. This is a brand new piece of work by Butterfly Conservation, which looks at the state of UK's largest moths, the larger moths in the UK. And you can see again, whilst there's a bit of variation, the overall trend is that downward trend in the same sort of trajectory as the global trends. Now, just because there's a trend downwards doesn't mean to say that some species are doing quite well. The grey mountain carpet isn't. It is doing pretty badly. It's at 87% decline since, 81% decrease over this period, over 1970 to 2016. Whereas the green carpet, another related moth in that family, had massive increase. So, you know, there are winners and losers, but on the whole, there are more losers than there are winners. And we'll look at that in a second. It's not just moths. If we look at other groups, you get the same sort of patterns. You get the ground beetles there. This is another study which looked at the abundance of beetles, caddisflies, and moths in I think it was in Germany as well. This is the graph for the ground beetles, and you can see the same idea that there's this decline, fairly steady decline over the last 30 or 40 years. In the UK, we have a set of indicators for biodiversity, and these are produced by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee on behalf of the different governments in the UK. And what's interesting is that they have a biodiversity indicator for pollinators, and pollinators are important because of the role that they have in providing pollination services for our food, for our crops, and for our fruits and so on, but also for all the wildflowers round about us. And when you look at that indicator, again, you see this decline. This is slightly different in that it's not about abundance and numbers. There's an index calculated which takes 1980 as the base point, and then it calculates the change from that point. But you can still see that from a baseline of 100 in 1980, there's been a decline down to roughly about just over 70% there, or 70 on the index there. And the graph on the right-hand side of this sheet shows you just that idea of what's increasing and what's decreasing. You can see there that over the long term, there's a few species that are increasing there in this index, but there's more species that are decreasing. Over the short term, it seems to have leveled out slightly, as you can see in the graph there. You can break this down a little bit more. There's information in this indicator that you can break down a little bit more and look at those pollinators in a bit more detail. And here's two of the graphs here. So for wild bees, so these are not honeybees. These are the bumblebees and the solitary bees and so on that pollinate a lot of our crops and a lot of our wildflowers. And you can see again the idea that this starts at 100 and it is just round about 90 on the index now. So there's been a slower decline or a weaker trend there. And you can see again the winners and losers. And in the short term, the winners kind of outweigh balance out the losers. In the bottom one, though, the hoverflies are perhaps the forgotten pollinators. And we all think of butterflies and moths and bees as the pollinators, whereas hoverflies do an awful lot of pollination. And we can see that there's a big problem with hoverflies. Hoverflies seem to be driving the trend in the pollinator declines in the pollinator indicator. And you know we're down at sort of just over 60 on the index in this graph. And you see many more are in strong decline in that right-hand graph there. Just to focus on a couple of species, just to elaborate this sort of like winners and losers and the changes that are happening. This species here is now a Scottish specialist, a great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus. But this map shows the distribution of records for all time in yellow. And you can see it used to be found all across the British Isles, in Ireland and in England, Wales. But now, since 1990, it's only really found in the far north of Scotland, right up in the top of Scotland, in Sutherland, in Orkney, and Out Hebrides, and a couple of the Inner Hebrides. And one of the problems for this species is, whilst it can disperse fairly well, the habitats have been completely fragmented, and it really needs lots of flowers to forage on. And there's just not the expanse of flowers that there used to be. Whereas if you go up into the islands and up into Orkney and Sutherland, we've still got that sort of rich, flower-rich landscape in the Maca. And that's why this species is probably just hanging on there in these areas. A different bumblebee and a different distribution pattern is the shrill-carded bumblebee, shrill-carded bee, Bombus silvarum. And you can see here, again, this species was fairly widespread across England and Wales, some records in Ireland there, just a couple in Scotland, in historical records in Scotland. But now it's restricted to areas in the south of Wales, in Bristol area, and in the Thames Gateway, sort of the London and Thames Gateway area. And this species is actually really only thriving on brownfield sites, on post-industrial sites that have reverted back to nature, and are at an early successional stage. They're rich in flowers that this species can feed on. There's also lots of habitat for it to actually nest in as well. This is a different example of a species that has been sort of like pegged into a particular type of habitat and has nowhere to go. And of course, with this species, these sites are actually prime development sites, and you know they're actually quite threatened themselves as sites, and that could have a big impact on the carder bee. So why are invertebrates declining? Well, many have quite specialist habitat requirements, that we just talked about there, and ecological preferences. They may need a particular type of plant or a particular range of plants. They may be restricted to a single plant. They may have particular ecological needs, so they may need to be in colder climates or cooler climates, or they may need some other particular habitat requirement, perhaps bare ground or something like that, which is quite particular to them. Habitat destruction and damage clearly destroys their homes. It can fragment them. It can mean that they're more difficult for them to be a resilient population. And they're often poor dispersers, which means that they can't get to the patches of land that are left that are suitable for them. They can't use that sort of stepping stones to move around the countryside. So they're basically isolated on this little island of habitat. And finally, the countryside is increasingly tidy and chemically controlled. We use pesticides and fertilizers with abandon, basically. It seems like there's not much thought goes into whether local authorities are going to spray the side of a road just with glyphosate to stop the weeds growing. Well, that those weeds are actually the food for early bumblebees. At this time of year, we'll start seeing dandelions coming up, and it seems to be there seems to be some people that think dandelions are a weed and need to be eradicated. Whereas for the bumblebees, the queen bumblebees coming out of hibernation at the moment, that is the prime source of nectar and for them to actually start their brood and start their population up again for the coming year. This is just a little graphic from the international platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This was an international review which looked at the drivers of biodiversity loss and biodiversity and ecosystem losses across the world, and they came up with 5 main drivers of species loss. Land use change that we just talked about, the habitat destruction, fragmentation, and so on. Exploitation, which isn't necessarily an issue for terrestrial invertebrates, but it certainly is an issue in in the marine environment, and things like shellfish fisheries and so on. That's where that comes in. Climate change is definitely an issue for almost all invertebrates. We are seeing species getting pushed to the edge of their climate envelope, the availability of climate that they can actually live in. We're seeing mayflies being pushed to the top of hills because the water's too warm, for instance. And we're seeing species retreating northwards as the temperature in the south of the country is becoming too warm. Pollution, whether that's pesticides or industrial pollution or whatever, has a big impact on populations. And finally, invasive alien species. So species that are native to another part of the world that have been introduced here, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and outcompete the species that are present in Scotland. Just to finish off really with I'll finish off this little bit with some examples of those drivers. This is a paper which looked at the range shift, the amount of movement that a species group would need to do to actually keep up with climate change. And here, these graphs are a bit complicated, but the solid lines, the solid vertical lines, are the climate between 1976 and 1990, the average sort of climate. And then the dotted lines are the modern climate, the 2001 to 2015 climate. And in between is the shift in the range of different species over that period. And the histogram shows the peaks in that. And the orange bars or peach bars or whatever color bars, the lighter colored bars is the average, is the mean of that shift. And what you can see from these is that there's been roughly the species need to achieve a 12-kilometer shift in their range every year to keep up with climate change. But what this study has shown is that they're just not managing to keep up. And these orangey bars should be up next to that dotted line, but they're nowhere near it. So that's the kind of problem that we have with species not being able to keep up with climate change and be overtaken, and they're being overtaken by it. Another study which looked at pesticides as one of the pollution top drivers. This was an interesting study that looked at the actual trends in some bee species, and that's the pinkish, reddish pink lines that are on these graphs. That's the actual trend. And what they did was they modeled what would happen if there hadn't been pesticides, and that's the blue lines there. So the particular pesticide neonicotinoids that we're looking at, they came in the early 2000s, and that's why the blue line starts there. And what they found that of the 40% of the bee studies that bee species that they studied, the distribution declines were greater than 10% due to neonicotinoid pesticides. Quite a complex study, and it's a complex model that they used, but it's interesting that they were able to pick out an impact of those pesticides on bee species. And just finally on the drivers, the invasive alien species. So the one that most people will probably have heard of now is the Asian hornet, which has, there's a lot of efforts to try and stop this getting into the country. But there's a huge number of different invasive non-native species that have made it to this country and are causing problems. This graph is again another one of the biodiversity indicators, and you can see that for the different ecosystems there, freshwater, marine and terrestrial, there's been a decade on decade increase in the number of species that have entered the country and established themselves. And the terrestrial environment, you can see there's a huge number there, something like 50 or 60 species in the decade. And while some of these species, we have many non-native species in Scotland. I think there's something over 1,000 species. Really only the ones that are invasive, the ones that cause a problem, that are a problem. And species like the Asian hornet, if that was to come in, it could have a widespread impact on our solitary bee species and other invertebrates. So before I hand over to Claire for her solutions to all this, I just want to finish with a little bit about Bug Life's policy. We put together a campaign, if you like, called No Insect Extinction, which is our sort of answer, our response to the insect declines crisis. And we see it as a prescription for healing the planet, for healing our invertebrate populations, and actually, doing something to help these species. And we've split it up into three different sections. So we want to see room for insects to thrive. We want to make sure that there's enough space for wildlife, and that's all connected up, and that they can move and they can flourish across the landscape. We want to make sure that those spaces are safe for these species. We want to make sure that they're free of pollutants in freshwater and on land, and safe from other factors like light pollution and climate change and non-native species. And finally, we want everybody to have a friendlier relationship with insects. We need to stop all the stories in the press about how spiders are going to kill you and wasps are the devil's own insect and things like that. We need to make sure that we actually we cherish our invertebrate populations, and that we understand the issues that are affecting them, and we try and help them in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. That was great. And cherishing all of our biodiversity is something which sometimes struggle with people, but we'll hopefully make some movement on that. But I've got some questions here coming in from the audience. Maybe you want to address those whilst Claire gets ready. So I've got a question here from Martha Schofield. She's referencing it. There seems to be quite a steep decline in upland Galloway, where you would think the landscape hasn't changed that much. I think she's talking agricultural landscape as opposed to the forestry landscape, which obviously has changed quite a lot. And some thoughts on this as a result of the changes in the types of pesticides that are being used and the treatments for sheep, etc.
So could you repeat that again? I missed the middle bit of that.
Okay, there's been a steep decline in parts of Galloway, which an area where the habitat hasn't really changed very much in the last 30 years, but sheep farming areas. But there's been a change in the veterinary medicines that are being used on sheep in that time. Do you think this has had an effect, and that's part of a driver for this change?
Possibly. The type of worming and other treatments that are used on livestock can affect the dung fauna, for instance, which can have a impact on other wildlife as well. Things that are feeding on the flies that feed on the dung. The veterinary medicines can get into fresh waters. There was a study just done just before Christmas there, which showed that flea treatments for dogs, for instance, were widespread in fresh waters and probably causing quite serious harm to some freshwater populations in some areas of the country. So definitely veterinary medicines can have a massive impact on invertebrate populations. Whether that's the cause of the declines in central Galloway, I don't know. I mean, other things that have changed is that replanting of forestry will probably use neonicotinoids to control pine weevil. So that's another source of pesticides in the environment. Whilst it will control pine weevil, it will also control everything else that's living around those trees as well. So there's perhaps a few different factors at play there.
Yeah, and last quick, a bit of comment, and we probably want to speak just like from Izzy Vasey. Would you say the obsession with the green square grass in the garden is really bad for biodiversity? I think it probably is. What do you reckon, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, the gardens could be the biggest nature reserve in the UK if we all work together to actually invite wildlife into our garden. Then it would make a massive impact. Even just having some wildflowers, flowering throughout the season makes a big difference. You'll see insects come into your garden and visit those patches.
And before we move on to Claire, I'd also say that keeping elements of your garden untidy is a good thing. I have quite an untidy edges around my garden, and I have got hedgehogs using it, quite a high invertebrate population. It makes a huge difference. Okay, moving on. Claire Pumphrey. We've had a presentation there from Craig, who is inevitably slightly doom and gloom, but our invertebrate populations are in deep crisis, and we need to highlight this. But Bug Life is trying to do something about it. It's not just shouting about the problem; it's trying to do something about it. So Claire's been working for Bug Life as a conservation officer for a number of years, and she's started to develop beelines across the central belt. Maybe we can think of these beelines as super highways for insects. So Claire, would you like to take it away, and I'll mute.
Great, thanks, Nick. Hopefully you can see my screen okay and hear me.
It's perfect.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so we've obviously heard from Craig that our invertebrates are in trouble and we need to be all doing our bit to help. So as an organisation, Bug Life focuses on two groups. So that's freshwater invertebrates and pollinating insects. And it's our focus on pollinators, which has led to the development of beelines. My screen to move on. Oh, sorry. So what are beelines? Well, beelines are a Bug Life-led initiative, and it's our imaginative solution to a big problem, which is the loss of pollinator habitat within the UK. So beelines are a series of insect pathways, and it's along these pathways which we are restoring and creating a series of wildflower-rich habitat stepping stones. Beelines link together existing wildlife areas, so things like our nature reserves, and it helps to create a network like a railway that weaves across the British landscape. So the beelines have been mapped as a network of 3-kilometre wide corridors. And as mentioned, they connect together the best remaining areas of wildflower-rich habitat. And this beelines map helps to provide a shared focus and help to direct the restoration and creation of pollinator habitat within the UK. The maps are data-led, but it's guided by local expertise and knowledge. So we've worked with various NGOs, local authorities, landowners to map the beelines across the whole of the UK. And the beelines are something that anyone can contribute to. So NGOs, local authorities, businesses, schools, landowners, absolutely anyone can get involved, and we would encourage everyone to get involved. And this is what the beelines maps look like. We've just completed mapping beelines for the whole of the UK, and this was launched recently. On the left-hand side here, we've got the beelines maps for Scotland, and on the right, you can see the whole network for the whole of the UK, and it's the red lines that we're looking at. And you can just imagine if everyone was to do their bit and pull together and help to create habitat along these corridors, the permeability, the movement that would create for our pollinators and other wildlife would just be amazing. And this map here just shows the beelines for the Galloway Glens project area. And as we mentioned, beelines are about anyone getting involved and taking part, and you can do this in various ways. So you can go onto our website and see if you actually sit within a beeline, if your garden's in a beeline, and then you can go to our regional maps and you can upload your data. So you can put in that information about the pollinator habitat that you've created, and then that information will be uploaded onto our maps, and then you'll start to see sort of all of this habitat stepping stones in this corridor being created. Even if you don't sit within a beeline, you can still take part by sort of, getting in touch with your local authorities, encourage them to take part in beelines, You can get in touch with local wildlife groups, see what opportunities there are in the area for volunteering and actually getting out and taking part. As mentioned, I've been working on the Central Scotland Beelines project. So the Central Scotland Beelines project is delivering pollinator habitat along the John Muir Way within the Central Belt. And the John Muir Way was actually identified as Scotland's first beelines in 2015. And we've had various projects along this route over the past few years. And the Central Scotland Beelines has come to a close today. But we've created a video just highlighting some of the work that we've been doing, and I wanted to share this with you today.
Welcome to the central belt of Scotland. We're here in the most densely populated part of the country. Between 2.4 and 4.2 million people live here, and that's about 60% of the Scottish population. So we're currently in Kirkintilloch outside the high school, and this is one of our sites from our Central Scotland Beelines project. We've got bulbs here that were mechanically planted, and they're just about coming up. We're in March, and that's about as early as we can get for bulbs coming up, ready for our pollinators to make the best use of them. At one of our other meadow locations. You can just about see the wildflowers coming through, and this will create a fantastic habitat for our pollinators here by the river as we move into the summer months. So all of this work is part of our Central Scotland Beelines project, which was delivered mostly in 2020 and funded via Nature Scot and the CSGN. The Central Scotland Beelines project builds on another really successful project that we delivered called the John Muir Pollinator Way, which has really become a leading example of how to deliver beelines in an urban area. challenges to creating good pollinator habitat in urban areas. A lot of our sites are quite small and restricted in how much wildflower meadow we can create, and we have to make sure that what we do put in that's good for pollinators is also good for the people that live and enjoy these green spaces. Beelines projects, we've worked with a number of local authorities, including Edinburgh Council, Falkirk Council, here in Eastern Bartonshire Council and South Lanarkshire Council, as well as working continually with many of the local authorities that span the Central Belt.
So just to say, what happens if you're not on a beeline? Well, not to worry, because there's still plenty that you can do to help our pollinators and other wildlife at home. And one of the first things that you can do, which we were talking about just earlier on, is actually creating a wildlife-friendly garden. So I'm just going to run through a few points about what you can be doing at home, and hopefully you can take some of this away with you today. So the first thing is to think about planting for pollinators. As Craig had mentioned earlier on, most people, when they think of pollinating insects, they generally tend to think about the honeybee, but actually we have over 4,000 species of native insect pollinators in the UK, which includes bees, of which we have over 250 species in the UK. It includes our butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps, and flies. So when you're planting for pollinators, you need to be thinking about various things. Firstly, if possible, try to plant native wildflower species of known origin, or at least go to a reputable nursery, because importation of plants is what brings in these non-native invasive species. And in Scotland, we've got a very good company called Scotia Seeds, and they're brilliant for providing local provenance wildflower seeds. You want to plant a variety of species with different flower shapes and that flower throughout the year. Again, thinking about different pollinating insects and thinking about their needs. Some of them have different length tongues. Some of them prefer to land on things like our daisies, which are an open pad for the pollinators to land on. So it's really thinking about providing that for them, and again, making sure that we've got that source of nectar all year round. And you want to avoid plants with double or multi-petaled flowers. So things like our pansies and double begonias, they look really pretty, but they've been bred to look pretty, and they offer little to no value to our pollinators at all. So yeah, thinking about planting for all of the seasons. Generally, what we're seeing is pollinating insects emerge from March through till October. But with climate change, we are seeing more and more insects emerging earlier on in the year, and in certain places, certainly down south, we're seeing them, particularly bumblebees, present all year round. So it's thinking about making sure that we have enough pollen and nectar available for them. And some of the flowers to think about for spring, for instance, is the dandelions. Again, going back to what Craig said, how important dandelions are for our pollinators earlier on in the season. Things like garden plants, grape hyacinth are really, really good, and bee flies in particular like these. And then think about shrubs and trees as well. So, you know, thinking about those borders and the edges that you can have in your garden. Things like apple willow, blackthorn. Blackthorn's really, really good. And And then some summer flowers, so legumes, so thinking about red and white clover, these are really good because they have amino acids, which are what our pollinators need, so particularly our bumblebees need this for successful breeding. So if you can have some clover, then that'll be really good. And foxgloves are particularly good for our long-tongued bees, so things like our garden bumblebees. And then garden plants, sweet williams are great, and of course these are really good for companion planting with if you have an allotment as well. And then again, the shrubs and trees, things like dog rose and privet. And with privet, you just need to be careful because it is amazing for pollinators, but it's quick growing and it can get a bit invasive. So you just need to make sure that you keep that in check. Autumn flowers, again, ivy. Ivy is an amazing plant. It's such a good source of sort of later nectar and pollen. But it's not just good for our pollinators, it's also really good for like our bat species. So if you've got kind of large areas of ivy, bats will hide in, but I've also seen wrens building nests behind ivy as well. So try not to clear it all. I know that a lot of people see it as an enemy, but actually it's not. It's our friend and it's our insect's friend. And then with the garden plants, things like late flowering heather are really good. And then your herbs as well, which again, we benefit from having the herbs in the garden. And very fitting BB tree. And then thinking about the winter months. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, kind of thinking about having something flower throughout the winter months, but actually, you know, our winter bulbs are very good for our pollinators. And this picture here of the hoverfly on the snowdrop, this landed on the snowdrop literally as I'd been planting it in. So I was planting them in green, and as soon as we put them in, the insects came. And then things like your winter agonites, crocus, lesser celandine. And then garden plants, hellebores, which are really pretty, but they're also very good for our pollinators. And one of the most important trees, willow. So willow is just amazing as an early nectar source. Again, going back to things that we've already talked about, one of the easiest things that you could do, but also one of the most effective things, is to let your garden go a bit wild. And we're not asking you to turn the whole garden over, but even just having a corner will just provide so much for pollinating insects, but also other invertebrates and other wildlife. So this will help to attract in things like grasshoppers and our true bugs. And by having this wildflower patch, you're also going to have this area for overwintering sites and also food sites for other invertebrates. So our butterflies and moths, for instance, they'll be laying their eggs in these longer vegetation, and then their caterpillars will be feeding off some of the food plants within that. And then, of course, by having this area, you're then going to get things like your birds come in. They'll be feeding off of the caterpillars, particularly during springtime. You know, the amount of the caterpillars that the blue tit chicks require to eat, for instance, is a huge number. So without the insects, you're not going to get the other wildlife as well. So it's thinking about all of that and thinking about the entire food chain. And again, you know, things like hedgehogs sort of coming in and nesting in this area. And it's actually really important to have a variety of structure within your garden. So thinking about having those shorter areas, but then having the wild areas. You know, short lawns can provide good sort of basking sites as well for a lot of invertebrates. And having a wild area is different to having a wildflower meadow. So with this wild area, what we want is that to be left all year round. Whereas if you want to create a wildflower meadow that is, you know, full of sort of nectar-rich flowers for our pollinators, what you want to do is actually be cutting that meadow back at the end of autumn and removing those cuttings to remove the nutrients. You can either do this through just letting your lawn grow and seeing what establishes there, and then cutting that back, as I mentioned, or you can plant in a wildflower seed mix. And wildflower seed mixes, a traditional mix is 80% grasses and 20% wildflowers. A lot of these pictorial meadows, that's not generally what we're after. What we're after is the grasses in that mix as well. So you want to remove that turf, and then you want to create a nice fine tilth and sow your seed, which can be done in the spring or the autumn. Let those flowers grow up throughout the summer months, and then again cut it back and remove those cuttings, because traditional wildflower meadows and species-rich grassland like nutrient poor conditions, and then they also need that space for the flowers to grow. Another thing that you can do is to give a bee a home. So as mentioned, we have over 250 bee species in the UK, and the majority of these are solitary bees. And when we think about solitary bees, we have our aerial nesting bees and when we have our ground nesting bees. And our aerial nesting bees, they would be nesting in things like hollow plant stems, but we can replicate this by creating an insect hotel. And you probably would have seen these in various sort of stores. You can easily make your own by using bamboo canes, and sort of you want them hollowed out, and you want to position this at least above 1 meter in height, and you want it to be in a sunny position, so sort of south-southeast facing. But you can also create a bee hotel by getting pieces of wood and drilling multiple holes within that of different sizes, because you have different size bees, and it's just something quite enjoyable to do as well, particularly with kids. Again, moving on to our ground nesting bees. So something you can do at home is to create a bee bank. And it doesn't have to be as big as this, but this is an example from some of the ones that we've been putting in through the Beelines projects. So to create a bee bank, it's quite simple. You can use aggregate, type 1 aggregate, and then you cap it with sand. And you want that sand to be at least 30 centimeters deep. And what will happen is that the ground nesting solitary bees, they'll excavate down, and they'll create these little cells and nesting cavities, and they'll go down and they'll take some food and they'll lay their egg, and then they'll cap it off and then come out, and then the following spring the solitary bees will emerge. But bee banks are also really good at providing other basking sites for butterflies, but also things like our tiger beetles really love bee banks. Again, a very similar thing is to create a bug hotel in your garden. And this can be something as simple as using some mesh and just putting in things like some bits of twigs and deadwood and leaf litter. And then, you know, that's going to help to support things like our woodlice and our millipedes and centipedes. Or you can get a bit more complex and adventurous with it. Things like pine cones are really, really good, and you'll get things like spiders and stuff in here as well. And then obviously by attracting all of these other invertebrates into your garden, you're going to then get things like your frogs and your toads, and then again, things like your birds and stuff have got plenty of food to eat. Another really, really good thing to do is to create a pond. So a pond of any size will help all sorts of wildlife. So, you know, a lot of thirsty mammals and birds will benefit from this, but also a lot of our invertebrates depend on water, so to complete their life cycles. And it's good to have a pond of any size and also to plant it up for our pollinators as well. And you could be really adventurous with your pond and have a bigger pond like this one. And you need to think about having different levels within your pond. You want a shallow sort of gradient and slope so that any wildlife that's in there can get out. And think about the types of plants that you're putting in as well, and how this will support the different invertebrates. So you want to make sure you've got some oxygenating plants in there, but also things like amphibious stalk is really good. And bog bean, again, you need to kind of keep that in check, but these plants are really good in particular for things like dragonflies. And again, you can create really nice planting within that. So on the outside, things like purple loosestrife and yellow flag iris, which are really, really beneficial for our pollinators. Or you can go a bit more simple and have a tub like this. And it's also really important to mention, so species like our hoverflies depend on having water to complete their life cycle. So it's worth thinking about that when you're thinking about planting your garden for wildlife, thinking about their whole life cycles and what their requirements are. And we've got loads of information on our website about this, and we'll share some of these resources with you. And this is a sort of freshwater invertebrates that we'll be looking to attract. Things like our dragonflies, damselflies, caddisflies, and our water beetles. Another thing that we've already talked about quite a bit tonight is to not use pesticides. And this advert here just mind boggles. I mean, you've got a plot of plant killer, ultimate bug killer, sorry, which then is saying free seeds for bees. It just doesn't make any sense. A lot of the research that we're seeing, even with things like our glyphosate, for instance, you know, you're targeting what you see as a weed, but that's something for our pollinators as food. And it travels up the food chain as well. But what we are seeing is that even if it doesn't kill the insect straight away, there's sort of research going on now which indicates that it impacts the behaviours of the insects. So things like not being able to get back to their colony, or that maybe they're not defending their nests well enough, but it also impacts things on their breeding. And why use pesticides when you could create this amazing environment and let the wildlife do the work for you? You know, all of our invertebrates have a role to play within the ecosystem. And if you're taking one out, then it's going to have an impact on the other. So this picture here, for instance, this shows a leopard slug. And leopard slugs are actually a gardener's best friend. So the leopard slugs, they require nice damp environments, and they feed off of fungi and decaying leaves. So they're really good at nutrient cycling. But they also feed on other slugs. So those pest slugs that you don't like, these slugs will feed on. And it's the same with, you know, thinking about aphids and the problem they cause. Well, if you're having your wasps come in and you're having your ladybirds come in, they will help control these pests for you. So just leave the pesticide alone and let wildlife do the job. And again, going back to the fact that, you know, if you're putting things like slug pellets down, that it's going to go up the food chain. So obviously our hedgehogs can enjoy eating slugs, to be impacted by this as well. And the last thing in terms of sort of thinking about your garden is to try and use peat-free compost. So our peatlands are incredibly important. Not only are they really good at the carbon sequestration, they obviously provide an amazing habitat for a range of invertebrates and other wildlife, and also help with reducing flood risk. Yet our peatlands are in massive trouble because of peat extraction through compost. And so it's just something really worth thinking about. And to be honest, there's some really good alternatives out there now. So things like this wall compost. And you need to be really careful about checking the labels, because some companies will say that they're completely peat-free, but actually when you read, say that they're peat-free, but when you look at the label, you realise that they're not completely peat-free. And obviously if it says it's organic, that doesn't mean that it's peat-free. So just moving on, aside from sort of things that you can do in your garden, one of the other really important things that you can do with helping invertebrates is to record your sightings. And then this helps us as well. So, you know, all of the studies that Craig ran through and all of this data is really important for us to be able to see what's going on with invertebrates within the UK and across the world. So if you can, it's really important to record what you find, and you can do this for various ways. So there's the iRecord website, which is really, really good, and you can get the app on your phone, so it's really simple. You can download the app, and then when you're out, you can take a picture of something and you can upload it, and it puts all of that data up into the system for you. Or you can get in touch with your local record centre. And what you need to be recording is the location, the habitat, the date, and the name of the surveyors. And remember to take lots of photos, because this will help the experts to verify them. And you never know, because you might end up with something really exciting. We've had it a few times where someone's taken pictures of something and they're struggling with ID, and they've sent in the picture to us, and then we've ID'd it, and then it's been a really rare species. So it just shows that it's really worth doing. And a recording scheme that's really worth getting involved with right now is the flower insect time counts, which is part of the pollinator monitoring scheme. And this is run by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I did have a little video, but I will just put that in the chat for you. But fit counts are really simple for anyone to get involved with. And what you do is you pick a patch of flowers, and you watch it for 10 minutes, and you record the different pollinators that visit that patch of flowers. And you don't need to be able to identify it to species level. What they're looking at are the insect groups. So things like, was it a butterfly? Was it a bee? So it's as simple as that. So it's just a nice thing to get out and do. So you don't have to have a garden. You can go do that as part of your local walk. And right now, I think that's something that we enjoy doing. And that runs from April through till September. And just to sort of end that, Bug Life can help you to help invertebrates. You know, you can sort of help us by supporting our work and become a member, and this will help to keep us contributing to the projects that we run. And we have a newsletter which you can sign up to, and we'll be sort of sharing different types of workshops that you can get involved with, any sort of exciting news that's happened. And we also have various resources online, like I've mentioned, which, you know, things that you can get involved with, including the gardening for bugs at home. Yeah, if we're running a project in your area and you're about, and when we're allowed, please come out and help us with volunteering as well. It's just, you get to be with like-minded people and learn new things, and it's just nice to be out doing our bit. So thank you for that. I'm probably a bit quicker because the video didn't work, but hopefully you all took something away from that. It's a bit of a quick run through because it's such a wide subject and there's so much information out there that yeah, we could be here all day if I kept going on and on. So thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be...
Thank you, Claire. No, that's really good. And actually, what's so encouraging is that, yeah, Craig was quite right to come up with the doom and gloom. We are in a perilous situation, but there's so many things that people can do and action that they can take themselves. Before we get on to some of the questions, I'd also like to thank a couple of people that are in the chat room. Craig Nisbet in particular. Craig Nisbet from Bug Life is answering questions on behalf of Bug Life. He currently works for Bug Life, but at about half an hour's time, he will stop working for Bug Life. So most people get taken out for a drink on their last day at work. But in this instance, Bug Life have told him he's got to stay in a presentation until 9 o'clock at night. So thank you very much, Craig. I hope they do buy you a good leaving present. Right, on to some questions here. We've got Quite a number of questions, and I was particularly taken by some of the questions on the beetle bank, not the beetle bank, the bee bank, and people using them for cats going into. But it looks like a simple thing to make in the corner of your garden, I guess, in the full sun. Are there a problem with cats? Can you get around that problem? If both Claire and Craig can answer these questions.
Go on then, Claire.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because they will dig into that.
The best thing you can do is some companion planting. There's a few different plants. I mean, particularly lavender. Cats don't like the smell of lavender. You can, in the house, you can use lavender oil to stop cats scratching on things and the like. But you can actually plant it in your garden. They won't. You could plant it round the bee bank, and it would also not just deter the cats, but it would actually provide some forage for the bees. There are a few other plants, garden plants, which I can't remember the name of. I think the common name is scaredy cat, but I can't remember what the Latin name is. But that's another one that gives off a scent that cats really don't like. There are some suggestions in the chat about using sort of meshing or chicken wire and things like that, which might work, but I think that it might just disrupt the cats a bit more. You know, I don't know. I've never tried that, but certainly lavender works.
Great, and a good bee plant as well.
Get a water pistol.
Other people may hear you, Claire. Another comment came in on a private message from, I can't remember his name here, but it was about Buddleia. So it wasn't one of the plants that you mentioned in your favoured list. And yeah, I've kind of got a feeling myself with Buddleia. It's called the butterfly tree. It's beautiful, smells quite nice. It's plastered in butterflies at certain times of year. Yet it is quite invasive. Does Bug Life have a position on this?
Well, it's nice in your garden, but once it gets out of your garden, it's terrible. So I mean, if you're going to have it in your garden, it takes over all sorts of sites in urban areas. I've got a stretch of wall where it's actually breaking the wall apart because it's managed to root itself in it. Once it's finished flowering, what to do is to cut off the seed heads and destroy them, and then so that the seeds aren't going to get dispersed. Try and keep it pruned down in the winter and just not let it go wild and escape. And that's the key. That's the key with all garden plants. I mean, we see if you go onto some of the islands, you'll see Crocosmia or oh gosh, I've forgotten the other name. Yeah, I've forgotten its name. Anyway, you see Crocosmia along the verges, and that's just escaped from gardens as well. You just need to keep on top of it. So let your garden go wild, but don't let it escape over the wall.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of our worst invasive species, the Japanese knotweeds and the Himalayan balsams, they all escape from gardens. And yeah, it's actually in Scotland, it's actually a legal requirement to keep them in your garden. But quite how you would prosecute someone, I'm not entirely sure. I got another question here from Bernard Saunders, who often asks questions, and he's involved with beaver groups up in Tayside, and he's wondering about beelines and the sorts of habitats that the beavers are creating, which is obviously a big rewilding subject at the moment. Any thoughts on that?
You want to, or will I, Claire?
I'll let you go for that one.
So there's positives and negatives with beavers. I mean, they are great ecosystem engineers. They will improve freshwater conditions. They'll provide sort of like pools and wetlands that wouldn't be there at the moment. They do feed on some plants that are important, or trees in particular that are important for particular invertebrates. And if they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, there's not enough of that habitat, then there's just another pressure on those rare and threatened invertebrate species. That said, if there's more coppicing of willow, then we're going to get more willow growth, which is going to benefit pollinators and other invertebrates as well. So it's really a balancing act. It's about making sure that the habitat is there for them before they get there, I suppose, which we've not been able to do with the Tayside population because it's expanded from releases, whether they're legal or accidental.
Okay, and last question. Before I say that, by the way, everyone, all these questions are being stored, and there will be a YouTube clip of this event at a later date. But it's something I see an awful lot. So it's Katrina Caldwell has commented that Lidl are currently selling wildflower bombs for £3 each. A German company. Are they like to be native for wildlife? Lots of people getting excited about them, good or bad. I probably have some feelings about this sort of thing, but Claire, you're talking earlier about the Scotia seeds. So, what's your thoughts about Lidl?
Yeah, so there's obviously been a big rave about this recently, and you've been seeing all of these bee bombs. Personally, I'm not a fan of bee bombs. I just don't think they actually work that well. But also, a lot of the bee bombs that are being advertised as wildflowers, yes, they're wildflowers, but they're not native. Well, most of them aren't. And I think, you know, again, maybe this is something that is okay for your garden. But actually we've got some really amazing native wildflower species. So I think that, you know, surely having something that's native is far better than having something non-native.
I think that if the kind of rule to give yourself is if it doesn't tell you what it is and where it's from, then don't buy it.
Yeah.
And that goes for seed and for plants.
And also that you're less likely to have success with them.
Yeah.
Because if you're buying local provenance seed, so buying from Scotia Seed, for instance, it's you know, it's from Scotland, so it's acclimatized, so it's used to our climate. Whereas if you're buying something that's not from the UK, then it's very unlikely to you know, actually be suitable for our conditions.
And there are plenty of nurseries that are doing that, so that, you know, creating plug plants as well from local source, you know, like Celtic wildflowers or Quercus plants and the like. You know, look for your local look for your local plant nursery and ask them to do wildflowers.
That's great. Look, it's coming close to the end of the evening now, so Claire, Craig, and Craig as well, in particular on his last night. Thank you both and all three of you very much. There's loads of questions still coming in. And to give a pause for everyone to maybe just have a quick look through and try to harvest some of the links. But I tell you what, I'll put all the links out from the comments in a Facebook post in a day or two. But if you'd like to maybe now all unmute your microphones and do the traditional applause that we do for everyone at the end of a normal conference. And hopefully we'll start these things in the real and in the flesh in a few months' time. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to go and have a look.